All right, cool. We'll get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming to my talk, The Illusion of Almost Done, What You Need to Remember When Shipping a Game. First, I would just like to acknowledge the people of the land. So I'd like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, of elders past and present, on which this meeting takes place. So I'll just go over a brief overview of what I'll be discussing. So I'll have a brief introduction just about myself and the talk, and then I'll be going over the importance of trust and communication in closing a project, protecting team morale and celebrating wins, and building hyper-awareness of service teams and their importance, and then finally just a few key takeaways and summary. So, brief intro. Just a bit about me. Just over a year ago, I'd moved from Perth to Melbourne. I really love video games, TV shows, film, the F1, gym, music, collecting vinyls and figures, and a lot of other things. That's just a photo of my partner and I. He moved over with me. And a bit of my career background. So I've worked at Murdoch Uni as a project coordinator in the digital team. I worked at Bankwest in both the home loans and everyday banking teams in digital space as well for their website. I worked at a company called VGW, Virtual Gaming Worlds, where I was supporting the team to ship 2 projects concurrently every 6 weeks with a team of 30 that I was helping look after. And now I'm at PlaySide making awesome games. And I think my love for shipping games really comes from probably the most stressful part of development comes from all of this past experience, because that's what I've really done the most and where I really thrive. So just a bit about the talk. A lot of this is about the 90-90 rule. So what that is the last 10% of development often feels like the last 90% of development. There are 3 key areas that I'll be going over, which are, the importance of trust and communication, protecting team morale, and building hyper-awareness of service teams. There are a couple of assumptions coming into this talk that I'll have, which the team has gone through pre-production, and a degree of success metrics exist for the project. And this does apply to both video game and non-video game projects, and we'll have some questions at the end. Nice. All right, so here are just the general phases of game development, and I'll be focusing on here, just at the end of production, and here, throughout post-production, just before live ops. Now, my talk may seem a bit like a Tarantino movie. It will be in 3 parts, so it may seem very separate, but by the end, it'll all come together. And of course, no violence and no swearing like his films either. And of course, there are typos in this image, but I thought it was a pretty good meme. So, part 1, the importance of trust and communication in closing a project. If you do not communicate, you are not going to ship. This may seem so obvious, but it is extremely crucial. And this doesn't mean just being like, hey, how's it going? How's the project going? And you're like, yeah, good, thanks. It's more about the meaning, like how meaningful your communication is. It's about communicating early and being upfront and considering others when you communicate as well. And having a team in like a fostered safe space where they do feel comfortable to speak up. So, the importance of communication and trust. It does help the team trust each other, because if they don't, they're likely not going to feel safe to speak up when things aren't going well. And then things just kind of fall apart because everyone goes into silos and works in their own spot and doesn't fail to see the bigger picture, which also helps create a safe space within the team. And it also helps producers help the dev team, and the dev team help themselves. All of this communication shouldn't just be for the benefit of a producer. It needs to be for the benefit of the dev team as well. Like, for example, say you're in stand-up and someone's like, hey, I'm working on X thing, or I'm blocked on something. And then someone else in the team can be like, well, actually, I'm looking into this as well, or something adjacent to it. That sort of safeness within the team helps with the feeling comfortable to speak up with those things. So what does good look like for communication? You need to foster a safe space for communication, and this goes for written and verbal. Be mindful of how you communicate. So one thing I think is important is to have a very lean amount of channels. And that, whatever you use, Slack, whatever, and try and keep them public when you can. So one thing that I've come across is if you have a lot of private channels, it just feels like large DMs. And if you have large DMs, then people tend to go into their own DMs as well. And if your team doesn't feel safe enough to talk openly in an open channel, one idea that I've used in the past is to have a public channel for communication out to stakeholders and a private channel for the team to speak openly. And this kind of helps separate that in a way, but then also it brings a bit of psychological safety there. And have hyper-awareness of all disciplines, and no discipline should ever, ever, never work in a silo. And roles and responsibilities are defined. So here's a method of defining roles and responsibilities with a RACI chart. So RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. It really does help define these roles and responsibilities, and it should be a living document. Work with your team to update this maybe every couple of months, whatever kind of works for your team. And as you can see, generally on the left is the responsibilities, and on the top is the roles. And there should be only one A in each one. I know that there are a few here that don't have an A, so not the best visual example, but it kind of brings across the message. And yeah, so you can, sorry, I lost my brain. But yeah, so that's that really. All right, so a bit further on what good looks like for communication. Vital documentation exists for all disciplines, is communicated and accessible. If you have documentation and it's just kind of here, there, and everywhere, and no one knows where it is, then technically it doesn't exist. You should be able to ask anyone in your team where vital documentation sits, and they should know. The team is prepared for closing a project. So throughout your milestones, kind of practice that mindset as you get close to, say, getting out your vert slice or your first playable. And demo and play tests should happen every week at a minimum. And why this is so important is it helps the team continually see the bigger picture, because especially when you get so close to the end of development, you kind of go through the motions of, finishing sprints, closing tickets, closing epics. But these playtests help the team think about the game still, that bigger picture, and what really reminds what we're working towards. Here's just a quick example of a good documentation structure in Confluence. You have your global dashboard up the top, and that's usually for the company level. And then you have your little spaces underneath, so that can be by project, by team, whatever really makes sense. And then under each space, you have your pages. So the home page will generally be, say if it's a project, it will tell you all basically the one-pager equivalent of everything you need to know. And then under that, you'll have your structure of maybe it's where your GDD, TDD, all those other documentation sits. And I really highly suggest that you think about the structure / information architecture of this before you go in, because by the time you're close to the end of development, things are just going to get placed in random spots, and you're not going to be able to find anything, which is the last thing you want. So how do you build trust? Lead by example. If you are a leader and act in one way and expect your dev team to act in another way, you're just setting up a double standard, and the team isn't going to feel great about that. Be clear that failure is okay and it's more of a learning. So be open with your team and admit when you've failed or done something wrong. Showing this vulnerability will make the team subconsciously feel safe to also speak up when things aren't going well. Have clear outcomes, goals, and how success is measured. Usually it's defined by a director, product manager, producer, or equivalent, and it must be communicated and accessible, pin it to your channels, post it in Confluence, wherever it may be. and it encourages and inspires the team to work towards a common goal. Your director and producer need to foster that there are no pivotal changes to the game you're making in this time. And the reason why I put the asterisk there means that if you're going down a path of what does not look like it's going to be good, you can make a change. But if you're going to close to the end, you're like, I'm going to switch from single player to multiplayer, don't do that. Because it's going to damage team morale. If you do end up needing to make a pivotal change for the betterment of the project, make sure you are open with your team and really tell them the why, because they will really respect that. So this quote, I think, really resonates with me from one of my favourite business books, Radical Candor by Kim Scott. Care personally, challenge directly. So really you should try and care personally with each individual on your team, but then when you need to challenge, don't feel afraid to. Having that personal one-on-one relationship with your team will make it easier to also challenge your team or individuals directly, say when they're not performing to expectations or aren't delivering to standard. So here are some common pitfalls and strategies to overcome them. Not having a long-term vision. This really isn't sustainable, and it will end up with flip-flop decisions being made. So to overcome this, have a vision and roadmap. You need strong product goals or a roadmap, any type of vision, otherwise you'll feel like you won't be able to get away from that immediate now or see the bigger picture. It also helps team health stay positive. Avoiding problem analyses. So if you don't this, you really don't know what the issues are. So to fix that, fix the pain points. I suggest having one-on-ones with your team and find out what's working and what's not. And then see where you can kind of guide the team and everyone to a good spot. Don't be a blocker to your team. So to do that, find where you can support your team. You must be there to support your team and help drive them to get the best results. Don't be a blocker and don't add in process for process sake. So just to summarize first part, be mindful of the how when you communicate. Practice the closing mindset throughout development and lead by example to your team. Part 2, protecting team morale and celebrating wins. So why this is important. It is one of the most stressful times of game development, and you need to go in knowing you'll cut scope and things are going to go wrong and not to plan. The team needs to feel passionate and good about what they're delivering at this stage. And if not, it has the potential to damage morale. Because when you're in the rush of delivery, celebrating wins becomes even more crucial. So to boost morale, the producer must have a good working relationship with their director and project leads and vice versa. This can easily drive a sense of camaraderie from the top down to the rest of the team. Keep your priorities clear and always be open and transparent with your teams. That's for any decisions being made or really any kind of thing that the team needs to know. You don't want to feel like there are kind of secrets being kept from everyone in the team. And as well, as a project leader, don't panic outwards because it will flow onto the team. You need to keep a level head as possible. Have a zero tolerance for toxic behaviours and blame. Call that out whenever it happens. Call out when things have gone well as too. And involve the team in final scoping. The team will have the most in-depth knowledge about the game or product and how it works, so you must, it's almost like a no-brainer to involve them. So there are some constraints to consider when thinking about scope. So this is the iron triangle of project management. So you're kind of constrained by the 3 time, scope, and cost. So cost is the financial constraint. So this can be budget or resources generally. Scope comprises of the tasks necessary to achieve a project's goals. and controlling scope is especially more critical, as adjustments made to scope almost guarantee an impact to cost and time. And time constraint represents the project's scheduled completion. Managing time is closely related to managing tasks, as the overall timeline is broken down by individual tasks and timing. If one or two are fixed, you can only ever change the non-fixed ones. So if headcount and time are fixed, then you can only really change scope. So balancing, polishing, and bug fixing. You need to balance, otherwise you're not going to ship a working game. And you only really have one shot. So yes, you can fix forward later with a patch, but when you ship that like 1.0 or into early access or whatever it may be, that's when the most eyes are going to be on your game. And not enough bug fixing also equals a buggy, unplayable game. Not enough polish equals an unbalanced, less visually attractive game. And you will not get enough time to complete everything. And there is a distinct difference between polish and bug fixes. Polish is refining existing features or balance refinement in a game to get them to a shippable state. Bug fixing is fixing broken features or fixing defects. Oh, I had them there. All right, so this also needs to be prioritized. So you need a hard rule and line in the sand where no more polish happens and just bug fixing becomes the priority. And this must be shared to the team. This is super crucial because if you don't do this, then you're gonna be at a stage where it's like, maybe we wanna do like some more balancing or something, and then you're gonna blow out scope very quickly. So one thing I suggest is having bug triages and frequent playtests. All feedback and bugs should be triaged daily, and not one size fits all. So do what's best for your team and game. And here's just a quick example of some priorities levels for bugs and tasks. It's really easy for the team to see what to pick up first and what's the most important. Like as you can see here, the highest, high, medium, low, and lowest. So cutting scope. You're gonna have to cut scope. Things are gonna go wrong. Things are gonna go haywire, but that's okay. So the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, states that roughly 80% of outcomes come from 20% of causes. And this helps, like, you can use this principle to help prioritize tasks and business efforts. And it's really a nice reminder to focus on the core, like 20%. So you should focus on the things you give the biggest outcome, but that can be a challenge to figure out. So decisions to cut scope are going to be more difficult than at the beginning of your project. So you're going to have no more milestones to push back to. You're going to have less or no time to experiment on features like you could in pre-prod or early production. And the iron triangle really helps visualize this. Prioritization is key, and cutting something people have been working on for months or years may have to happen. So it could be because you didn't have the time, or you didn't quite hit the mark in the intended feature, or you don't have the resources to complete the feature. So you really do need to make a decision. And you must have open conversation with your team and explain the why. And I'm just reinforcing this again, that the iron triangle helps with this. All right, so here are just some pre-filled Miro templates. I have visual examples I have. Miro is my favorite tool. But the following ones I've used are really effective. So it's just some advantages of the Moscow. So this is must, should, could, and won't. It's really great for demonstrating what's an MVP, which is generally your must. And warrants also are very important because it's explicitly saying what you're not doing. So if someone comes in and is like, hey, have you thought about this? You'll be like, yes, and we've made a conscious decision to not do it. And it helps easily communicate to the team and stakeholders. Some disadvantages: it doesn't show how you came to that priority, and it's tempting to overestimate the number of musts. The RICE prioritization, so that's reach times impact times confident over effort equals the score. So that's the total on the right. So some advantages for this: it lessens the influence of inherent bias on prioritization. It's great for data-driven games, and it gives you a high-level priority of features. Some disadvantages: it doesn't take dependencies into account, and it can be subjective and inconsistent. Impact versus effort. This is maybe my favorite one. So some advantages: what constitutes value or effort is flexible, and it's a good tool for alignment, and it's really easy to use. Some disadvantages: it leaves a lot of room for cognitive bias at the hands of people doing the estimation, and it's hard to use with large teams with multiple components. So with this, there's a big importance in having a ramp down strategy. So some scenarios that cover this are rolling people off and onto a new project, sunsetting a project, or ramping a team down to live ops. You need to work out the right times to ramp down team members off the project, and generally by the bug fixing stage, you should have only technical people, like plus a producer and then your leads. So here's a quick example mock-up of a resource plan. The producer is the one who owns this, and they must keep it up to date. And use this as a communication tool to your director and team. And talk with your project leads and consult them when ramping staff. And be transparent about ramp times with your team and tell them the why. So if they are ramping off a project or maybe going half-time, tell them why that's happening. It's very important. Celebrating team wins. So call out when things are going well in stand-ups, retros, Slack, whatever it may be, and name people when you can. I found it really effective that if you're like, hey, thanks, person, name, you've done a great job on this, it feels a lot more personal and a bit more meaningful. If your team has to deal with live ops incidents, make sure you have a good strategy in place. And getting close to closing is a really great time to start coming up with that. And make it a big deal when the team has done something well. I think that's really important. So, how to celebrate team wins? You can show the team the positive impact your product or game has had. So go through, show them some great reviews or feedback from a demo to stakeholders. Or maybe, hey, we've reduced X amount of customer service tickets coming through. And, that can have a significant impact. Or thanking team for small things. And last one, having trailer viewing sessions. So maybe you're getting close to 1.0 and the official trailer is going to come out. Bring everyone in and have an exclusive pre-trailer viewing and it's just kind of make it a whole big deal. And then you're like, hey, we kind of got this exclusive view before the whole world sees it. And some activities you can have for celebrating team wins, such as lunches, bowling, vouchers, mini golf, virtual quizzes, retro video game day. And be considerate of your team, their location. So if you have remote people on your team, make sure you consider them too. And venue accessibility, if they need wheelchair access, if they have certain light sensitivity, or maybe they don't drink alcohol or are recovering alcoholics. They're all things you need to consider. And not all team events will be for everyone, and that's also okay. So to summarize part 2, remember the iron triangle. Prioritization is key, and you will need to cut scope. And celebrate the wins. Okay, third and final part, building hyper-awareness of service teams and their importance. So, what is a service team member? Generally, it's someone that is on more than one project or not 100% dedicated to the project. So, some disciplines could be such as audio, QA, UI, UX, anything kind of along those lines. It could even be consultants as well, depending on where you work. So give the team members and or their leads enough heads up that a project needs, so adequate planning can be done. And Like, I think that's also, really important. And really make sure they feel like they are part of your team. So add them to relevant meetings and discussions. So like stand-ups, planning sessions, have them in the relevant channels, bring them along for the journey, and onboard them like you would any other team member. And you never, ever, never want your service team members to feel like an afterthought. So how to support service teams? Having documentation prepared and accessible is so critical, and I'd say probably the most important for QA, because you need to minimize ramp-up times as much as possible. You need an open communication pipeline between the service and dev team. Don't keep it all in Jira, it's not a chat app. And approval pipeline established, so service teams 100% know when something is ready to pick up, like whether it's maybe audio, going to do their audio design, or QA, so they know when something's ready to actually test. Have like a risk assessment or register, and of course this isn't the only reason to have one. You should have one regardless, but it really does help those not 100% on a project. Know that sometimes you will need to waive certain processes, and to help ensure that like high priority fixes go through, and this needs to be communicated and established. And have service teams accounted for in timelines. This may seem very obvious, but it is very critical, and like include these people in planning sessions so they have a voice. So, when you are considering about planning a feature, they're also like, hey, we also need to consider X amount of time for whatever they might be doing, and this helps avoid unnecessary overtime and crunch too. So here's just an example of a risk register. So up the top, you can see like we have the risks, like the date it was raised, the risks, the description, so just giving a bit more information about the risk, who owns that risk, and that should be just one person. It's not really good practice to be like all the project leads or the whole dev team is an owner, because you can't really hold that individual accountable. The status of where that risk is at, the probability of that risk happening, and the impact if it does, which like see 3 times 4, 12, so that gives you an overall risk score, which does help with prioritizing it and seeing what the most impactful risks are. And then we have your mitigation of what you need to do for that risk not to happen, and a contingency plan, which is like worst case scenario, and the trigger date. So that's essentially when if you get to that date and the mitigation still isn't enough, then likely you may need to trigger the contingency plan. So to summarize part 3, everyone should feel part of the team. Documentation is critical, and have risks in mind when making decisions. So, to summarise, just to reiterate what we've covered, the importance of trust and communication in closing a project, protecting team morale and celebrating wins, and building hyper-awareness of service teams and their importance. And here are some takeaways. So like I said at the beginning, I said this is like a Tarantino film, so I hope you've seen these 3 individual sections come together and see their collective importance. So my first takeaway is have open and effective communication, as that will help your team and succeed when closing. Keep priorities and vision clear and accessible. Celebrate the wins, and make sure everyone's part of your team. Thank you. I have a couple of questions. Yeah.
Hello. What's some of your favourite prioritisation methods, and do you have a particular one that you like using in different scenarios?
I'd say my favourite is value and effort matrix, just because you have a good idea, or really like visually and kind of at a glance of like what's going to give you the most value. We'd say the least amount of effort, which would be like your quick wins. But like I think as well, like I really like the Moscow one too, because you can easily define what your MVP is. So depending on kind of the project, I tend to go for one or the other. But in more, I guess like in more like traditional software, RICE also works really well when you have a lot of stakeholders coming to you for a lot of things all the time. I think I go next.
Excuse myself.
Hi, just a quick one. When you mentioned bug triage, what is a triage?
So basically, like, say your QA people have been testing, and maybe you have like maybe external QA as well, testing overnight. Every day you go through all of those bugs and define the priority. The severity may be already set, but you can also just realign that too. And then like if there really are high severity, you know, maybe you make the decision to put it into your like current sprint or to-do list, or then you can push them out into further sprints if like they're not like maybe as big of an issue.
So kind of sorting through all the bugs you've found and prioritising, something like that?
Yeah, exactly like that. Yeah. Yeah.
I need it for the recording, so.
That's it. Thanks.
When you are looking at prioritizing, is there any value with kind of combining or doing a bunch of the different methods, or is that just kind of too time-consuming?
I would say it's probably a bit too time consuming. Like it'd be best to pick one just for simplicity as well. Because if you like maybe have, I don't know, like you use part Moscow and then part RICE, things could get a bit messy. Like, yeah, like maybe say for like value and effort, then there's generally merit in like doing a pre kind of session to having like that prioritization there where people in the team kind of define like what the t-shirt size is of those features. So like a mini estimation before coming to your final like value and effort. But yeah, I'd stray away from combining it a lot.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, thinking about the risk register and like upcoming risks like that, do you also keep like an issue register for things that have happened and how, like what was done to resolve those, or do you keep that for more like a retrospective?
So like, as in just things that aren't risks?
Yeah, so maybe like if you had an issue or challenge come up in the past and keeping a record of like what was done to resolve it.
Yeah, so I guess if you don't say if you don't have the risk register established from the beginning of your project, say, like yeah, you can capture that in retros, or you can even capture like say certain decisions made, or if it was like maybe a bit more like of a severe issue that maybe like affected production or something, you can conduct like post-incident reviews where it's like obviously no blame, but then you talk about the issue, the overall impact it had to customers, and yeah, like what actions you'll take in the future to try and prevent that from happening again.
Awesome, thanks.
No worries.
What do you do if you've got your risk register and a risk becomes an issue? How would you categorise it or treat it then?
Then you would pretty much like see like what the like maybe contingency plan is. You kind of talk together as a team too, to see like what the next steps are. Yeah, I think, is that it for questions? Cool, then I think we'll just finish up early. Thank you, everyone.